Okay, so I started my talk here in the Dust Bowl era because it's a useful example of how desertification is employed as a kind of discourse through which drought and land degradation can be understood, and how environmental crisis in arid and semi-arid regions can be communicated. But where do things stand today with these topics? Now, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, desertification as a concept, and especially as a scientific term, has been heavily critiqued by scientific and scholarly communities, especially in the last few decades. And here are just some examples of the kind of critique that has been done on desertification with these really provocative books that I really like. So for instance, this can be seen, right, in texts like Davis Thomas and Nick Middleton's 1994 book titled Desertification, Exploding the Myth, or Roy Bank and Michael Mortimer's truly mammoth 2016 collection with its equally evocative title, The End of Desertification, Disputing Environmental Change in the Drylands. But despite these efforts, the term and concept remain in use. And this is in large part because, for all of its faults, it's an established term for discussing drought and land degradation in dryland regions specifically. So by that I mean that we could talk about land degradation and drought kind of en masse, but desertification, one of its great strengths is that it refers specifically to how these issues play out in arid and semi-arid regions. So there's no readily accessible alternative that has that exact same significance. So that's one reason why it's still around, and of course it's also still sort of holding on in part because it is still used by the United Nations and its programs. Namely, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, or UNCCD, which was ratified in 1996 following the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And it was ratified alongside two better-known conventions, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So the UN's approach to and use of desertification today is markedly different from how the New Dealers were using it in the Dust Bowl years. For instance, desertification today is understood as part of the complex system of environmental impacts resulting from anthropogenic climate change. And at the same time, desertification remains a tool through which the UNCCD can communicate the scale and threat of land degradation and drought in drylands, albeit on that much more grander global scale. So for example, we can take a look at the UNCCD data dashboard, which is this program and page on their website that they launched last year, I believe. And it essentially collates data from countries' yearly reports on drought and land degradation. So all of the countries that have ratified and signed on to the UNCCD are encouraged to submit an annual report on these issues, but they're not required to. So the issue with the data dashboard is that none of the data is standardized, so countries can fill in these reports kind of as they wish and if they want to. There's a disclaimer on the UNCCD's website explicitly stating this and sort of saying that it would be hard to draw conclusions from this research for these reasons that the data is inconsistent. But this hasn't stopped the UNCCD from making their own sort of conclusions and posting them on their social media. So for example, here is some ways in which the UNCCD has been publicizing data gathered from their data dashboard. So the first here you see it says that with images of deserts, more than 20% of land in Central Asia is degraded, and then here on the right it reads more than 20% of land in Latin America and the Caribbean is degraded. Now, significant and worth noting here is that the UNCCD is organized around 5 regional implementation annexes to guide its anti-desertification work. These include Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Northern Mediterranean, and Central and Eastern Europe. So what they're talking about is kind of directed by those regional implementation annexes, which notably don't include somewhere like Australia or the US, which also experience drought and land degradation. Some other examples that we can look at here on this side, it says more than 100 football fields worth of healthy land lost in Africa every minute. And over here, we have between 2015 and 2019, the world has been losing at least 100 million hectares of healthy and productive land every year. If we continue at the same rate, 1.5 billion hectares will be lost by 2030. So these are really big, sort of spectacular claims that they're making regarding land degradation and drought. Now, something that we might notice here is that the actual term desertification isn't included in any of these examples. By and large, despite the name of the convention itself, the controversy surrounding the term has meant that the UNCCD has started to avoid its use. And this is quite a recent change too, in the last, say, 3 or 4 years that they've started to shift away from it. However, avoiding the term doesn't mean that the ideas, images, and narratives central to desertification as a discourse aren't present within the UN's materials. And here I want to make clear that while I'm pointing out the sort of spectacular nature of these posts and headlines, I'm not implying that drought and land degradation aren't serious threats intricately tied up with climate change. As in the Dust Bowl example, the crises of drought and soil degradation is very real. However, the issue lies in how these crises are framed as a kind of permanent, large-scale transformation into a desert-like environment. The notion that we are losing 100 football fields per day in Africa is not dissimilar to the idea of an encroaching desert front that characterized representations of the 1930s Dust Bowl. But again, imagining the daily transformation of so much land in a parcel that we can easily imagine a football field, imagining that amount of land transformed into degraded waste is a far more compelling image than the slow and often highly localized decline in soil productivity that is characteristic of land degradation. This slow decline is even more complicated when we recognize that land degradation occurs across a very wide spectrum. So it's not a binary categorization of degraded and lost, or healthy and good. This lack of distinction makes soil degradation difficult to study, and perhaps even more difficult to visualize. So the idea of a daily loss of soccer fields stands in just as a skull-imbued dust cloud might. But perhaps the best example of desertification discourse at work today can be found in one of the UNCCD's flagship programs, which is the Great Green Wall. The Great Green Wall project was conceptualized in 2007 by the African Union. It was initially conceived as a literal wall of vegetation, mainly trees, spanning and bolstering the southern border of the Sahara Desert. And you can see that in the logo. That's where the Great Green Wall is supposed to go, and that's the southern border. So that's what's known as the Sahel region. And the Sahel region is a place that has been associated with desertification for a very long time, especially within the UN. The UN's conversation on desertification really started with a conference held in 1977 that was sort of made to be the UN's response to what's called the Sahelian drought, the Great Sahelian drought of the late 60s and early 70s. So in a sense, the Sahel really put desertification on the map, and is also genuinely an area of arid and semi-arid lands that are extremely susceptible to both severe drought and land degradation too. So it's kind of it's a mix of both. There's like a historical tie that determines why we look to the Sahel for desertification and to locate anti-desertification work. But at the same time, it is also a region that does need assistance and does need attention to deal with these environmental crises. So the idea of a wall of vegetation or a green belt to halt the advance of desert-like conditions is not a new one. And various iterations of this idea have been organized in many countries over the years, including the US during the Dust Bowl. They had their own green belt program. But the project initiated by the African Union in 2007 remains one of the central mitigation projects currently supported by the UNCCD. The Great Green Wall is also one of the most controversial projects for addressing desertification in Africa, and much has been written about its implausibility, both of its construction and its efficacy in actually restoring land. So critics point to the huge water cost of maintaining so much vegetation in a region that is naturally either arid or semi-arid, and they argue whether it would have any real impact on the region because, of course, the Sahara Desert is not actually advancing. Further, planting vegetation does not necessarily restore degraded land, although it can certainly be a part of restoration processes. Planting in degraded soils can seriously worsen conditions by pulling nutrients and water from the soil, especially trees. Trees are often favored by green wall programs and by anti-desertification programs in general, but they are especially resource heavy. They're intensive. They take a lot of water, they take a lot of nutrients, especially if they're not well suited to those regions. Since its inception, however, the Great Green Wall project has shifted its focus, and today it's conceptualized as a loose chain of land restoration projects across the continent. So the idea of a green wall is really more of a metaphor that kind of holds it all together. And is sort of used to help visualize, again, like a string of kind of more community-based restoration projects. And yet the project's marketing, public communications, and name still suggest that initial visual concept of a verdant wall holding back the desert. And the current marketing campaign for the project, which is entitled Growing a World Wonder, presents the project as the creation of a new living world wonder, eclipsing the Great Barrier Reef in scale, which certainly suggests an actual physical structure. This conceptualization of the project speaks directly to that idea of an advancing desert threat that is central to desertification discourse. So for all of its faults, the Great Green Wall project is making good use of desertification discourse to publicize various land use programs and especially to garner financial support. In this, it's been particularly successful. In 2021 alone, the project received 14.3 billion US in pledged support from the One Planet Biodiversity Summit in January of 2021, and at COP26 in November of that year, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos pledged a further 1 billion USD. A recent report by the FAO praised the investment strength of the project. And so while there are certainly criticisms to be made here, it's important to recognize that the Great Green Wall project and its efficacy, while there are criticisms to be made of that efficacy itself in terms of what they're actually doing with that funding, under the narrative and structure of desertification as maintained by the UNCCD, the Great Green Wall is kind of an exemplary project. It's bringing in resources, it's bringing in public interest, it's easily and widely publicized, and it's raising awareness about this key issue. So while the controversy surrounding desertification and within the scholarly and scientific communities has resulted in the UN distancing itself, at least somewhat, from the term, the Great Green Wall Initiative demonstrates that much of the cultural presence of desertification with its related ideas of that encroaching desert threat existing at grand scales and promising these sort of dark futures has actually remained remarkably consistent over time. We're still talking about holding back desert threats. A literary and cultural analysis of desertification makes clear the strength of its discursive functioning and helps to explain why the concept has been, as geographer Bank and Mortimer write, remarkably resilient over time. Recognizing the cultural complexities of desertification might help us to put these ideas to rest. For instance, if the UNCCD were to shift its framing of land degradation and drought away from notions of desert advance, then initiatives like the Great Green Wall might be able to break away from those same metaphors. At least a break would be easier to accomplish or to imagine. However, I'm also interested in what an attention to the literary and cultural dimensions of desertification tells us about narrating environmental crisis, especially in arid and semi-arid regions. So what makes a good narrative of environmental crisis? Can we find a balance between accuracy and efficacy? And of course, what do we do with concepts like desertification, which are here sort of stuck in the sort of public lexicon of environmental crisis and climate change, which are flawed, certainly, but nevertheless contain images and narratives that remain popular, perhaps even effective. Now, I take these questions very seriously, in part because we are in dire need of finding new ways of thinking about environmental crisis in the age of climate change. Drought in particular, while perhaps not spreading like a dark cloud over the surface of the earth, as one might imagine from many depictions of desertification, it is becoming more frequent, longer lasting, and more severe as a result of alterations to the water cycle and weather patterns resulting from climate change. The scale of drought is becoming more difficult to comprehend, as is the distinct but related issue of land degradation. The amount of productivity and soil health that we are losing is similarly difficult to comprehend. Desertification as a discourse does not solve these issues in representation. I think it's far too problematic and simplistic, really, to do that. But I am interested in how we might experiment with these ideas to come up with new ways of thinking about environmental crisis in dry lands. So in essence, while the faults of desertification make it an unsuitable basis for policymaking, its success as a pervasive and effective imaginary of environmental crisis warrants further exploration. How might desertification as an idea be useful in efforts to communicate the scale and threat of the climate crisis, not as a direct model, but as something to learn from, or more abstractly, as a kind of imaginative tool? And so here we might take some inspiration from fiction. So for instance, Claire V. Watkins' 2015 novel, Gold-Famed Citrus, experiments with the idea of desertification in her surrealist depiction of the Amargosa, a living, moving dune sea that has taken over most of the southwestern US in the near future world of the novel. Now, what's interesting about the Amargosa, for my purposes here, and in terms of thinking about it as a representation of desertification, is that the narrator tells us that the Amargosa is composed of the particulate matter of generations of settler colonial land use practices. Specifically, it tells us that the Amargosa is made up of, quote, all the wanderlusting topsoil of Brigham Young's aerated southwest free at last, the billowing left behind of tilled scrub, the aloft fertilizer crust of manifest destiny, ashes in the plow's wake, Mulholland's America, end quote. Earlier in the novel, the cause of the dune sea is attributed to simply long-lasting drought conditions, what's referred to in the novel as the drought of droughts, the wind of winds. But here we can see that it's in fact the result of drought in combination with degraded soil conditions resulting from these legacies of settler colonialism and the history of agricultural exploitation in the US. These legacies are represented directly by references here to Brigham Young and the irrigation of Utah, and William Mulholland's manipulation of canal infrastructure and water rights to secure a few more decades of water for the city of Los Angeles. The novel presents the southwestern US as buried beneath a sea of its own making, the particulate matter of centuries of environmental degradation brought to a newfound extreme via the megadroughts of the climate change era. The Amargosa Dune Sea is therefore not just a representation of severe drought, or just an imagining of a drought with no end. It's also a representation of how drought can, in the age of climate change, be shaped in profound ways by human action. It's more than just a natural process in these areas. And so in this way, Watkins reconstructs desertification for the 21st century, refiguring all of the most potent elements of its discourse into a critique of exploitative land practices and of the very misrepresentations that shaped desertification as an idea throughout the 20th century. The novel is constantly pushing back against an understanding of the Amargosa as a dead wasteland. So I'll close this talk by returning to the image with which I began. Because while it's critical to understand how these representations of the Dust Bowl are inaccurate and misleading, we might also consider how they demonstrate a creative approach to tackle the representational challenges of what was, in the 1930s, an unprecedented environmental emergency. The Great Plains were not transforming into a desert, but the idea of encroaching sand dunes and depopulated futures for the region served photographers, journalists, scientists, and politicians alike as a way of presenting the extreme scale of the threat in combination with a call to action. In this case, the call to action was focused on offering support to New Deal agencies like the Resettlement Administration. So I think that our own historical context, wherein we are trying to both navigate and fight against an increasingly climate-changed world, can help us to appreciate the particular struggle of these policymakers, photographers, and other cultural workers who were trying to narrate what was happening on the Great Plains in the 1930s. And this is not to ignore the serious faults or misgivings of desertification discourse, but rather to acknowledge its complexity and to ask, how might desertification be reimagined? Thank you.